The gavel cracked, and the room swallowed its breath as the narrator watched power change hands without moving. Victoria Lancaster said, "The law has spoken," and a dozen cameras nodded like obedient dogs. Maya Brooks said, "Truth will answer," though her pulse stuttered. Evan Hale said, "You do not have to stand in this storm alone," and set his calm like a wall. Lex Carter drifted close, thin as a rumor, and said, "They edited the chain of custody at 2:13. Jonah Reyes said, "Let the record reflect the court's ruling," and his voice fit the marble too well. The judge rose, and the verdict trailed her like smoke. The narrator traced the flash of a small drive in Lex's hand as he pressed it into Maya's palm. Maya said, "If they cleaned the blood, they missed the stain," Evan said. "Then we find it outside." Sirens braided with rain, and justice felt like a door left on its hinges. Rain hissed over the plaza as the narrator traced the tight orbit of strangers pretending not to stare. Maya said, "If they erased our path, they left a seam," and slid the drive deeper into her coat. Evan said, "We moved together, or not at all," and matched her pace to the curb. Lex said, "Night edits, same login across 3 terminals," and his voice bounced under the eaves. Jonah held the door for cameras and said, "I'll request access, properly, like a man polishing a badge." Victoria's entourage flooded the steps, and microphones throbbed like a pulse. Maya said, "Start with evidence logs," and did not look back. Evan said, "I'll keep them busy if they notice." The narrator tasted damp stone and headlines, and every light felt like an eye that would not blink. The cafe steamed like a wet coat, and the narrator watched sugar packets line up like little alibis. Maya said, "We verify before they patch the hole," and woke the laptop. Evan said, "Sip first," and slid a cup near her hand. Lex said, "Timestamp loop at 2:13 and 3:41, and sketched the barista with lazy precision. Jonah said, "Night clerk credentials appear consistent, though his tone wore an ironed crease." The audit trail stuttered, then redrew itself as if embarrassed. Maya said, "Cross with badge swipes," and her focus narrowed to a point. Evan said, "We can ask inside channels," offering a softer door. Lex said, "Or we pick the lock," and tapped the trackpad twice. The narrator felt the room lean toward the screen, and time shrink to a cursor. The narrator followed the cursor through directories named like empty rooms. Maya said, "Chain of custody, PDF replaced 5 hours after seizure," and dragged a copy aside. Lex said, "Checksum mismatch confirms a swap," and grinned without joy. Evan said, "Who signs a correction at 3 a.m.? And the question hung like a light bulb. Jonah said, "Clerical cleanup happens," and the phrase landed like a bandage over a fracture. A redacted field blinked awake, then darkened again. Maya said, "Pull the night clerk," and wrote the badge number down. Lex said, "I can map their IP trail," and spun the laptop. Evan said, careful with mirroring, and rubbed a smudge from the screen. The narrator tasted dust, coffee, and the edge of an open file. Drizzle stitched the street as the narrator kept pace with 4 shadows and 1 verdict. Maya said, "We talk to the night clerk before the story gets rewritten," and scanned the dark windows of the annex. Evan said, "Polite first, firm next," and angled his shoulders to shield her. Lex said polite is slow, and checked the battery on a recorder. Jonah said, "I'll request official access tonight," and looked like a door with a lock on both sides. Somewhere, a freight elevator coughed awake. Maya said, "We take the stairs," and tested the handle. Evan said, "If this goes wrong, I take the heat," and meant it. Lex said, "If this goes right, they feel it," and tucked his sketchbook away. The narrator measured the rain and the promise inside the seam they had found. Mist unspooled along the river as the narrator watched candles lean into the damp. Maya Brooks touched a metal plaque and said, "I brought the letter, but not the courage." While the current murmured, Evan Hale said, "You carry more than you admit," and eased his voice like a blanket. A gull skimmed the gray water, and the city exhaled behind the trees. Maya said, "If truth is here, it's shy," and slipped a recorder into her pocket. Evan said, "Then we will listen until it speaks," and steadied the trembling flame. The narrator traced the groove where a name had been polished by weather and hands. Traffic hissed over the bridge, thin as breath leaving a chest. The river kept its counsel and waited. The storage unit breathed dust as the narrator followed a beam of light through stacked boxes. Maya Brooks said, Riley kept notes and pried open a lid branded by old tape. Evan Hale said, "We read when you're ready," and set his calm on the concrete like a mat. Lex Carter said, "Sketches, receipts, a venue," and slid a notebook free. Jonah Reyes arrived with careful footsteps and said, "Chain stays intact even here," as if speaking to the air. A strip light hummed like a low verdict. Maya said, "We track every name and aligned pages by date." The dust turned in the beam like ash that couldn't settle. The narrator counted each breath as evidence. Notebook pages mapped a life in neat lines, while the narrator tracked a path of underlined times. Maya Brooks said, she circled the glass house twice and tapped a Metro card with worn edges. Evan Hale said, "Close to something is close to danger," and lifted a yellowed receipt. Lex Carter said, "There's a sketch of a camera mount and traced it with a thumbnail." Jonah Reyes said, "That site is under renovation," and checked a listing on his phone. A Polaroid smiled from the margin like a dare. Maya said, "We go where she went," and squared her shoulders. The room smelled of paper, ink, and old resolve. The narrator listened for a page that wanted to speak. The glass house creaked like a ship as the narrator followed 4 beams across fractured panes. Maya Brooks said, "Riley's last recorded stop," and swept her light along the catwalk. Evan Hale said, "We're not alone," and tightened his stance near the door. Lex Carter said, "Mounting holes here, fresh," and crouched beside a beam. Jonah Reyes said, "Keep to the lights," and marked a path with a measured tone. Rain whispered on the roof like static over truth. Maya said, "Recorders hide where echoes gather," and scanned a rusted brace. The air tasted like metal and old plants. The narrator counted steps to a sound that wasn't theirs. A tiny glint nested in steel while the narrator held breath with the dust. Maya Brooks said, "Riley recorded someone," and lifted a device with careful gloves. Evan Hale said, "Evidence bag," and opened plastic that crackled like frost. Lex Carter said, "I can clean the audio," and angled the recorder toward a small light. Jonah Reyes said, "Chain of custody begins now," and wrote each detail with tidy strokes. Thunder rolled across the panes and left the air thinner. Maya said, "If this voice names a door, we open it," and sealed the bag. Evan said, "We move before the night edits the truth again," and checked the exit. The narrator felt the runes shift from maybe to must. Night pooled in the small apartment, while the narrator counted coffee rings like failed alibis. Lex Carter said, scrubbing the hiss now, and the waveform crawled across the screen. Maya Brooks said, "Play it," and steadied her breath the way divers do. Evan Hale said, "We go slow," and set a hand close enough to anchor her. A muted voice bled through static and tugged the room forward. Jonah Reyes stood at the doorway and said, "We authenticate before we assume." The cursor skipped, then froze, and the air felt crowded by unseen listeners. Maya said, "If this holds, it changes the shape of the room." Evan said, "Then we shape it back." The narrator watched time narrow to a blinking light. The room leaned toward the speaker as the narrator let the first clear syllables land. A precise voice said, "Deliver, then disappear," like instructions for a vanishing act. A second voice said, "You promised," and something fragile cracked. Maya Brooks said, "That's Riley," and every light seemed to sharpen. Evan Hale said, Please let this hold, and paced the breath between words. Lex Carter said, I can isolate the floor, give it bones. Jonah Reyes said, chain means nothing if source is tainted, and checked the time. The clip ended, and silence spilled like salt across the table. Maya said, start from the top, and the cursor rewound. Lights flickered and the narrator felt the apartment hesitate like a witness. Maya Brooks said, they're already inside, and closed a hand over the drive. Lex Carter said, local backup saved 3 minutes ago and reached for the external. Evan Hale said, we need a safer room, and moved to block the window. Jonah Reyes said, I'll take the device to evidence with official weight. The directory coughed up a ghost file, then swallowed it whole. Maya said, mirrors now, explanations later, and nodded once. Lex said, Dead Man Link primed, as keys rattled like rain. The narrator ranked the risks, and found the list longer than the night. The community newsroom smelled like cold paper as the narrator counted tired monitors. Maya Brooks said, mirror copy stays here, and slid the drive into a tower. Evan Hale said, trust buys time, and exchanged a nod with a wary editor. Lex Carter said, Dead Man Link seated across 3 nodes, and masked a grin. Jonah Reyes said, this is reckless, and watch the upload bar creep. A printer stuttered like a nervous witness, then fell quiet. Maya said, reckless is waiting while they erase us, and tapped the timer. Evan said, we leave a breadcrumb they can't digest, and checked the exit. The narrator filed the hum of fans under the sound of courage. Roaring, new ocean shore. They found the apartment door ajar, and the narrator measured silence like a bruise. Maya Brooks said, nothing's gone, and tracked the new order of familiar things. Evan Hale said, a warning shot, and checked the window locks. Lex Carter said, they moved the photo, and reset Riley on the shelf. Jonah Reyes said, we proceed by the book, as if the book still fit the world. The couch cushion held the imprint of an absent guest. Maya said, we are not spooked, and set the recorder in her pocket. Evan said, we shorten our loop, and scanned the hall. The narrator held the room's altered shape until it settled. Dust rose in ribbons as the narrator watched aisles of metal cabinets breathe like quiet animals. Maya Brooks said, the metadata lists a second device, and traced a printout with a knuckle. Evan Hale said, 2 recorders mean redundancy, or fear, and steadied the lamp. Lex Carter said, timestamped clusters match the night edits, and tapped a pencil, fast and thin. Jonah Reyes said, relevance requires corroboration, and kept his voice on rails. Paper corners lifted in the vent's sigh as if trying to leave. Maya said, Riley met Victoria here, and set a finger on a circled date. Evan said, then this room holds their echo, and closed the drawer. The narrator felt the floor tilt toward a truth that would not blink. The recorder hissed like rain on foil, while the narrator held the room still. Riley said, you promised my sister would be safe, and the words cut clean. A measured voice said, deliver, then disappear, and the air thinned. Maya Brooks said, that is him, and her focus became a blade. Evan Hale said, tell me I'm wrong, and searched faces for rescue. Lex Carter said, spectral match puts it near certain, and highlighted peaks. Jonah Reyes said, context matters, and did not breathe for a beat. The clip ended in a small click that hurt to hear. Maya said, we livestream the truth, and closed her hand to stop the shake. The narrator counted the seconds until someone moved. Silence pooled in the seams as the narrator watched understanding lock the doors. Maya Brooks said, you traded us, and the room shrank to the span between them. Jonah Reyes said, I baited a larger ring, and words tried to pass for courage. Evan Hale said, at whose cost, and grief lined his mouth. Lex Carter said, we pushed the leak, and the cursor hovered like a held breath. A siren curled outside, thin as wire, Maya said. We stopped letting them name the risk and angled the laptop. Jonah said, You will not control the burn, and reached without moving. The narrator felt the hinge of the story give way and swing open. The narrator heard the city inhale as the upload meter began to crawl. Maya Brooks said, No more waiting, and pressed the key that ended that habit. Hale said, Brace for fallout, and shifted to shield the door. Lex Carter said, Mirror nodes live, and smiled without heat. Jonah Reyes said, You're lighting a field you cannot cross, and watch the bar climb. The room's lights caught the rhythm of distant sirens and made stripes of doubt. Maya said, If fire is truth, let it eat lies first, and check the stream. Evan said, We hold the ground we can stand, and nodded once. The narrator tasted metal and decision. Phones awakened like startled birds while the narrator tracked the chorus of alerts. Maya Brooks said, Now they answer us, and watched comments bloom. Hale said, They will strike back, and measured the exits again. Lex Carter said, Mirrors clean, links seated, and logged the nodes. Jonah Reyes said nothing, and silence sat beside him like an accomplice. A notification showed a donor list unfurling like a map. Maya said, We follow the money, and tagged a thread. Evan said, We keep people safe, and steadied his breath. The narrator marked the moment the story left their hands and entered the city. Alarms needled the records room as the narrator watched folders breathe like fish on tile. Maya Brooks said, Show me the forms, and pulled the misfiled drawer wide. Jonah Reyes said, I swapped one packet to draw Victoria out, and would not flinch. Hale said, You broke the spine that held us, and steadied the table. Lex Carter said, Elias tab here, misindexed by 2 letters, and pointed hard. Paper slid like dry rain across the floor and mapped a different history. Maya said, You gambled with our dead, and set the confession flat. Jonah said, I chose the risk that could end the ring, and folded his hands. Evan said, You chose yourself, while sirens bled through cinder. The narrator felt the room tilt toward a confession that no court would carry. The narrator fixed on the red stamp that refused to be ignored. Maya Brooks said, Riley named Victoria, and the ink looked fresher than the paper allowed. Hale said, Chain held until the switch, and traced the barcode with a thumb. Lex Carter said, Checksum confirms tamper after booking, and opened the audit page. Jonah Reyes said, Procedure failed you, so I bent it toward a greater catch, as if that were math. Maya said, It bent around you, and the file stopped shaking. The room hummed with vents and unresolved prayers. Evan said, Truth is straight or it isn't, and set the sheet between them. The narrator weighed the distance a stamp can travel and still be trusted. Footsteps gathered like weather in the hall, while the narrator counted locks they did not own. Maya Brooks said, We force review by daylight, and pocketed the packet. Hale said, We speak together, and squared his shoulders against the noise. Lex Carter said, Stream in 3 when we clear the stair and check the uplink. Jonah Reyes said, I will testify to the switch, and the words surprised even him. The exit sign pulsed like a heartbeat that had learned to lie. Maya said, We keep the story intact, and sealed the envelope. Evan said, We keep you intact, and moved to her side. The narrator read intent on 4 faces and saw the door become a line they would cross. The stream found the city like water finds a crack, and the narrator felt comments flood. Maya Brooks said, A confession was sealed from the light, and the microphones leaned in. Hale said, The chain was broken and hidden, and kept his voice plain. Lex Carter said, Mirrors seeded to public nodes and pinned the link. Jonah Reyes said, I am responsible for the swap, and let the words sit unshaded. A hush took the crowd and made room for consequence. Maya said, This is what remains when verdicts refuse us, and held the packet to the lens. Evan said, Hold fast, and the comments surged again. The narrator marked the shape of a truth that refused to apologize. When the stream guttered, the building inhaled and finally exhaled. Maya Brooks said, "This does not fix the verdict," and let the packet rest between palms. Evan Hale said, "It fixes the silence," and closed a cable case with care. Lex Carter said, "Mirrors hold across 3 jurisdictions and logged their checksum." Jonah Reyes said, "Then let the inquiry begin." And the fatigue left his face. The lobby clock clicked past another careless minute. Maya said, "We will measure justice by what breaks next," and folded the envelope shut. Evan said, "We leave together," and searched the edges for watchers. The narrator kept the hush like a receipt for what they had spent. Chance rolled off the courthouse steps while the narrator felt the stone carry the sound. Maya Brooks said, "Not just one verdict," and faced a sea of handmade signs. Evan Hale said, "We go after the network," and watched the crowd breathe. Lex Carter said, "They're naming donors in real time," and lifted his phone. Jonah Reyes said, "Subpoenas won't wait," and tucked files under his arm. Sirens braided with drums, and the air smelled like wet cardboard and resolve. Maya said, "We keep people safe while this burns," and scanned the barricades. Evan said, "You set the pace. I hold the line," and stepped closer. The narrator marked a city that had found its throat. The special inquiry chamber hummed as the narrator traced careful language like wire. Maya Brooks said, "We will show the switch," and set the packet down. Evan Hale said, "And the payments that followed," and aligned exhibits with calm hands. Lex Carter said, "Mirrors are public," and watched a clerk flinch. Jonah Reyes said, "Under oath," and lifted his right hand without tremor. Counsel adjusted a cuff and said, "Stay to scope," as if truth were a fence. Maya said, "Scope was bent to hide a confession," and pointed to the tab. Evan said, "Chain integrity ended at this signature, and let silence work." The narrator felt procedure strain and hold. Emotion slid across the table, and the narrator heard the word excluded land like gravel. Counsel said, "Confession is inadmissible on procedural grounds," and the room thinned. Maya Brooks said, "Truth still stands," and steadied her breath. Evan Hale said, "We take what we can hold," and drew a quiet line under the loss. Lex Carter said, "Then we hold everything else," and bookmarked every donor node. Jonah Reyes stared at the seal and said nothing while a clock clicked. The gallery shifted and whispered, softer than shoes. Maya said, "We keep building," and turned the page. The narrator learned how resolve sounds when paper refuses it. Reporters ringed the sidewalk while the narrator watched questions sharpen like arrows. Maya Brooks said, "If the door won't open, we pull the hinges," and faced the mics. Evan Hale said, "We dismantled the network and counted faces to read risk." Lex Carter said, "Targets queued," and pinged a thread to the crowd. Jonah Reyes said, "I'll give you names," and folded his list once. A van idled and made the curb shiver. Maya said, "We protect witnesses first," and nodded to Evan. Evan said, "We move on the weakest joints," and scanned the street. The narrator felt momentum outrun permission. The war room hummed with fans and consequence as the narrator traced red thread between pins. Maya Brooks said, "Consequence arrives even without a gavel," and marked a shell company. Evan Hale said, "Justice bent can still carry weight," and logged a freeze order. Lex Carter said, "Nodes collapsing along the west corridor," and updated the map. Jonah Reyes said, "These accounts starve the network," and slid a list across. A monitor ticked off closures like quiet fireworks. Maya said, "They lose people when they lose cover," and underlined a name. Evan said, "We stop when harm stops," and meant it. The narrator watched a machine come apart by patient hands. Dawn unstitched the fog as the narrator followed two figures to the river that had learned their names. Maya Brooks said, "I'm listening," and set a small recorder on the stone ledge. Evan Hale said, "I'm here," and let the morning do the talking first. The city yawned awake behind trees, shy of sirens for once. Water kept time with a pulse that did not hurry. Maya said, "Truth keeps knocking," and touched the sealed letter with a thumb. Evan said, "You answer when you choose," and stepped back a pace. A gull skimmed close and wrote a pale arc in the air. The narrator counted breaths until the first soft crackle rose from the speaker. The river held its counsel and waited with them. The recorder cleared its throat, and the narrator braced for a voice that refused to be gone. Riley said, "If you're hearing this, I chose the truth," and the air bright. Maya Brooks said, "I will carry it," and set both palms flat to stop the tremor. Evan Hale said, "You don't carry alone," and let that promise settle. Traffic far off sounded like rain still learning to fall. Riley said, "Meet at the glass house," and the past clicked into place. Maya said, "You kept the door open and swallowed a storm." Evan said, "We made it through and watched the river agree." The narrator counted each word as a key in a lock that had waited too long. The letter stayed sealed while the narrator watched decision take a new shape. Maya Brooks said, "Not today," and slid the envelope back into her coat. Evan Hale said, "The truth already breathes," and nodded toward the recorder. Wind combed the water and stitched silver along the current. A bicyclist rang a bell and left the path to them. Maya said, "I won't let paper decide what I know," and exhaled slow. Evan said, "Courage is not the opening but the keeping," and let silence agree. The gull returned and drew another soft arc. The narrator marked how choice can be quiet and still move the world. They returned to the memorial, and the narrator watched memory make room for breath. Maya Brooks said, "For what remains," and set a fresh candle near the plaque. Evan Hale said, "For what begins," and shielded the flame from a flirt of wind. The wick caught and steadied like a hand finding a rail. Noise from the waking city stayed respectful at the margins. Maya said, "We keep building the part that listens," and touched the stone. Evan said, "We measure by who gets safer, and let his shoulders ease." The scent of wax threaded the damp air. The narrator filed the moment as a promise that did not need a witness. The narrator left a final line as the river spoke in a language older than verdicts. Maya Brooks said, "Verdicts end with a period. Truth doesn't," and listened for the echo. Evan Hale said, "We keep walking," and stepped to her shoulder. The city gathered itself and tried a softer start. Clouds frayed and let pale blue through. Maya said, "We bend what will not move," and pocketed the recorder. Evan said, "We hold the ground we can love," and watched the light find her face. A quiet future took a cautious breath. The narrator closed the scene, but not the question it carried.